At 05:42 on the morning of June 3, 1942, over the pale, endless waters northwest of Midway Atoll, the sun had barely pushed above the horizon, spreading a thin strip of gold across a restless Pacific. The air tasted of salt and cold morning mist, and inside the cabin of the PBY Catalina, the smell of engine oil mixed with damp canvas and the stale breath of a crew that had barely slept. The aircraft trembled slightly as its long wings cut through pockets of fog, beads of condensation rolling down the metal skin and trailing into the slipstream like tiny silver comets. Lieutenant William Harding sat at the controls, feeling the slight vibration of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines travel up through the flight yoke and into his forearms. He had flown dozens of patrols like this, long, monotonous, heavy with the weight of expectation and fatigue, but something in the air felt different. A strange tension, almost physical, seemed to press against the cockpit windows. Behind him, the navigator muttered course corrections, while the radio operator tapped at his headset, struggling to pick up faint signals washed out by static. Someone coughed, someone else yawned. These early hours always felt like drifting between worlds, not quite night, not quite day, not quite alive, not quite dreaming. The Catalina skimmed low over the water, her hull throwing a ghost-like reflection across the calm surface. Visibility was deteriorating as the fog thickened, each patch more like a wall than a veil. The crew leaned forward instinctively, eyes scanning the shifting gray for anything: periscope, wake, a spark of metal, a silhouette that didn't belong. They were alone, far from Midway, and the ocean around them felt impossibly vast, as if ready to swallow both aircraft and men without a sound. Then the mist parted, just a thin opening, and the co-pilot froze. "Contact," he whispered, though the single word struck the cabin like a gunshot. Through the clearing, shapes emerged, first faint, then sharp, then unmistakable. Dozens of warships. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, trailing long wakes as they cut eastward in tight formation. A Japanese strike force, moving fast, the morning light glinting off their decks like polished steel. Harding felt the shock ripple through his body. The sheer size of the formation was overwhelming. It seemed almost unreal, as if an armada from another era had surfaced from the deep. Instinct overrode fear. Harding banked the Catalina slightly, keeping distance while maintaining visual contact. The navigator scrambled to mark bearings. The radio operator fought the static, hands shaking as he adjusted frequencies and keyed the transmitter. The Catalina flew on the edge of danger, close enough to count the aircraft on the carrier decks, far enough to delay the moment the enemy lookouts would spot her. The message finally cracked through the radio waves. "Enemy fleets sighted. Coordinates as follows." The transmission carried urgency, breath, and fate. It was the spark that would ignite an entire day of battle. And as Harding turned the Catalina into the wind, climbing just a little to get a clearer view, a shadow moved across the deck of one of the Japanese carriers, a sign that they had been seen, and that the calm ocean below would soon erupt into fire. The PBY Catalina that carried Harding across the dawn skies was not a machine built to impress or intimidate. It was a long, heavy, almost awkward creature of metal and rivets, a flying boat whose silhouette looked more like a patient seabird than a weapon of war. Its wings stretched outward in a slow, deliberate arc that caught every gust of wind, and its engine nacelles vibrated with a deep, steady rumble that could be felt through every rib of the fuselage. Those who flew her often said that she didn't move through the air so much as she insisted her way forward, leaning on endurance rather than speed, surviving by persistence rather than strength. Harding understood this well as he listened to the rhythmic throb of the engines, a sound that, over time, became almost like a second heartbeat for the crew who trusted their lives to it. The Catalina's interior was cramped and utilitarian, more like the inside of a naval patrol boat than an aircraft. The metal floor panels were cold under the crew's boots, and the narrow passage between the pilot's compartment and the navigation station forced men to twist sideways as they moved. Insulation was minimal, so the constant hum of engines seeped into every corner, leaving a faint vibration in the air that made quiet moments feel eerily alive. Light filtered through circular side windows, casting a pale glow on equipment that was reliable but unsophisticated. Simple gauges, thick cables, rough welds, and radio consoles that crackled with static more often than clarity. Everything about the PBY was modest, but each part had been shaped by necessity, each compromise a reminder that this aircraft existed not to fight, but to find. Harding appreciated the Catalina's design for what it truly was, a vessel conceived not for glory, but for patience. Its greatest strength lay in its astonishing range, the ability to stay in the air for 18 hours or more, floating above the ocean like a silent witness to everything that moved beneath its shadow. The Catalina's slow cruising speed allowed the crew to examine every patch of sea, to distinguish the texture of waves from the straight, unnatural line left by a submarine periscope, to notice the slight metallic reflection revealing a distant convoy. Its capacity to land on water transformed it into a wandering maritime guardian, able to touch down near survivors, stranded aviators, or sailors lost in the immensity of the Pacific. It was a lifeboat with wings, a searchlight with engines, a patient hunter that replaced violence with vigilance. But the aircraft had its flaws, and these flaws were as much a part of its character as its strengths. The Catalina was painfully slow, vulnerable to enemy fighters whose speed and maneuverability could tear it apart long before its gunners could return fire. Its defensive armament, little more than a few machine guns mounted in blisters and hatches, was far from sufficient against a determined attack. Its bulky frame rolled heavily in crosswinds, and its massive wings made sharp maneuvers impossible. Harding always felt a knot in his stomach when visibility dropped, or when the radio operator reported distant engine signatures. They all knew that if a Japanese fighter squadron appeared suddenly, the Catalina would be little more than a drifting target. Yet despite these limitations, the aircraft had become indispensable. It could stay aloft longer than most fighters, glide low enough to see individual wakes, and endure the monotony of vast ocean patrols where more glamorous aircraft would have been rendered useless. The Catalina did not chase the enemy, it revealed him. It did not destroy fleets, it found them. And in naval warfare, knowledge often mattered more than guns. Harding knew this truth intimately, and as he adjusted the altitude trim and listened for changes in the wind, he understood that the fate of entire operations could rest on the slow, steady wings of a machine that few people would ever call beautiful. And now, after the encounter that morning, after the shadow of the Japanese armada had passed beneath their wings like a nightmare made real, Harding felt the Catalina's every vibration more acutely, aware that its endurance had become the only reason they were still alive, and the only reason the world beyond Midway still had a chance to prepare for what was coming next.
For Harding, the Catalina was more than a machine. It was a world suspended above endless water, a floating outpost where men lived, worked, and aged faster than they realized. Inside its narrow hull, the crew moved through routines that blurred into one another. Long hours of scanning the horizon stitched together with the steady drumming of the engines. There was no true comfort inside a PBY. The metal walls sweated with condensation during cold mornings and turned scorching by midday. The floor vibrated constantly, a tremor that seeped through boots, up legs, and into the spine until numbness replaced sensation. Harding often thought that the Catalina slowly reshaped the men who served inside it, carving endurance into their bones the way the ocean carved its marks into the hulls of ships. The crew lived on rotation, taking turns at observation stations, at the navigator's table, at the radio console, or simply lying on the floor with jackets folded beneath their heads for a few minutes of uneasy sleep. Sometimes Harding would glance back and see a gunner resting with his eyes half open, caught in that strange state between wakefulness and collapse that came after 15 hours in the air. Meals were little more than cold rations eaten with trembling hands, and conversations were sparse, muted by the roar of the engines and the weight of responsibility. No one complained. Complaints required energy, and energy was something the Catalina consumed relentlessly. Out over the Pacific, the monotony could be suffocating. Harding spent hours staring at nothing but water, a vast, indifferent plain broken only by shifting shadows or the occasional glimmer of sunlight. The navigator worked with quiet intensity, plotting tiny corrections, checking bearings, rechecking them, then marking the map again, knowing a single miscalculation could send them drifting into emptiness. The radio operator fought constant static, listening for coded messages that cut through like ghostly whispers. And above them all, like an invisible weight, hung the knowledge that danger did not announce itself. It emerged suddenly, brutally, without warning. Some patrols passed without incident, long, dragging days where the silence grew oppressive. The crew joked that Catalina duty gave a man too much time to think, and thinking too much in the middle of the ocean was never a good idea. Harding understood what they meant. The mind wandered in strange directions when confronted with so much stillness, drifting toward fears that hid beneath the surface of consciousness. The fear of running low on fuel, the fear of getting lost, the fear of spotting the wrong shape on the horizon and realizing they were too slow to escape it. In those moments, the Catalina felt impossibly fragile, a speck of metal floating in an ocean that could swallow it without trace. Yet boredom vanished the instant something appeared below. An oil slick, a lifeboat, a lone pilot waving frantically from a raft. The Catalina's crew had rescued more stranded men than they could count. Harding had seen the relief in their faces, the trembling hands that gripped the edge of the hatch as they climbed aboard, the disbelief that someone had found them in a wilderness of water. Each rescue gave the crew a renewed sense of purpose. It reminded them why they endured the exhaustion, the monotony, the dull ache that settled behind the eyes after too many hours awake. But there were darker moments too. Brief flashes of terror when something unexpected emerged from the haze, or when the engines coughed and the crew felt their hearts seize in unison. They had flown through storms that battered the hull with sheets of rain, storms where lightning turned the sky into a heaving battlefield of blinding white and black. They had skirted the edges of Japanese patrol zones, flying low enough to taste the salt of enemy wakes. Each time they survived, each time they returned to base with trembling legs and hollow stares, the bond among them grew stronger. And now, after what they had seen that morning, the vast enemy fleet slicing through the fog, the weight on their shoulders felt heavier than ever. Harding could sense it in the silence that filled the cabin, in the way each man moved with deliberate, almost solemn focus, knowing that one mistake could bring the Japanese fighters upon them before they ever made it home. The Catalina vibrated steadily beneath them, loyal but vulnerable, carrying a crew who understood that their endurance would soon be tested again in a way none of them could yet imagine.
Harding had learned long ago that the Catalina behaved like an entirely different creature when darkness swallowed the ocean. In daylight she was slow, heavy, exposed, a deliberate target for any enemy fighter sharp-eyed enough to catch her silhouette against the sky. But at night, once her hull had been repainted in deep matte black, once every reflective surface had been taped, once the crew flew with only the faintest glimmer of red lamps, the PBY transformed into something far more elusive. The men called them the Black Cats, and the name suited them well, for when the last light drained from the horizon, these aircraft slipped into the night as if absorbed by it, gliding low over the swells, until the difference between sea and sky nearly vanished. Harding remembered the first time he had taken a Black Cat on a night mission. The engines roared as always, but the darkness altered everything. It muted depth, erased distance, and forced every man aboard to rely on senses sharpened by instinct rather than sight. The Catalina flew just meters above the churning surface, close enough for the spray to mist the lower fuselage, close enough that one wrong calculation could send them plunging into the water. The moon, when it appeared at all, cast a shimmer across the waves that made the ocean look alive, shifting in great slow motions that seemed intent on reaching up to swallow them whole. The cockpit windows fogged constantly, and the only shapes visible ahead were drawn in ghostly outlines by moonlight or starlight. Harding flew by feel, trusting the instruments, but trusting the rhythm of the engines and the sound of the air rushing past the hull even more. The purpose of these missions varied, harassing enemy ships, dropping flares to illuminate convoys for bombers, sneaking into harbors to disrupt supply operations, but each sortie carried the same blend of dread and adrenaline. Flying a Black Cat required a strange mix of patience and audacity. The aircraft, for all its slowness, became a predator in the night because the enemy simply could not see her until it was far too late. Harding had approached destroyers so quietly that the men on the bow could be seen walking their night watches, unaware that a dark shadow drifted above them. The crew released depth charges with steady hands, watching the brief ripple before the ocean swallowed it whole, and then banked away before the first plume erupted upward, lighting the sea like a volcanic exhale. But the night was not kind, and it punished mistakes without mercy. More than once, Harding felt the Catalina jolt as a sudden downdraft pulled her dangerously close to the waves. The crew had endured moments when the horizon disappeared entirely, where the sky blended into the ocean in a seamless black sheet, and the Catalina seemed suspended in nothingness. Instruments wavered, altimeters quivered, and the hull creaked under the strain of low-altitude turbulence. The men worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary, each word carried by the faint hum of red cabin lights that made every face look as though carved from shadow. The most harrowing memory came from a mission near the Solomon Islands, when Harding slid the Black Cat between the silhouettes of two Japanese destroyers whose spotlights scanned the water ahead. The crew could hear the engines of the ships, hear the clank of metal against metal, hear the shouts of sailors on deck. They drifted forward at a crawl, hearts pounding, breaths shallow, until the moment came to throttle up and escape before the night gave them away. Harding remembered gripping the controls so tightly that his hands ached for days afterward. When they returned to base at dawn, pale with exhaustion, they said nothing, because nothing could truly describe that strange mixture of fear and triumph. And now, as the Catalina carried the news of the Japanese fleet back toward Midway, Harding knew the darkness would soon become his ally again. The Black Cats would be launched. They would prowl the night. They would disrupt the enemy's momentum and strike where visibility failed. But as he scanned the pale light spreading across the waves beneath him, he also knew that the enemy had seen them that morning, and tonight the darkness might not be on their side at all.
Harding had always believed that the true soul of the Catalina revealed itself not during patrols or night attacks, but during the quiet, desperate moments when men were stranded somewhere below, adrift in rafts, clinging to debris, drifting helplessly across the vast and indifferent Pacific. In those moments, the Catalina became something far more meaningful than a reconnaissance aircraft. It became a lifeline suspended between life and death.
Harding had flown rescue missions in every kind of weather, from seas so calm they looked like polished stone, to storms where waves rose like dark mountains, slamming against the hull with a force that made even seasoned aviators hesitate. Yet he never forgot that those below had no engines to rely on, no wings to lift them, no horizon to chase. They had only hope, and that hope often rested on the Catalina's ability to defy conditions no sane aircraft should attempt. The crew operated in a strange harmony during rescue flights, as if the exhaustion that normally clung to them had been pushed aside by a surge of collective purpose. The navigator leaned over his charts with intense focus, calculating drift patterns and estimating how long a downed pilot might have survived in the water. The radio operator sent out queries, listening for faint signals that might confirm a man's presence somewhere below the endless waves. The waist gunners scanned the horizon through blister windows, searching for the slightest unnatural shape, a piece of fabric, a hand raised in desperation, the pale flash of a signal mirror. Harding often felt the tension swell through the cabin as they approached the search zone, each man silently aware that time was always the enemy. When survivors were spotted, everything changed. The Catalina descended in a slow sweep, her engines groaning as Harding guided her toward a swell pattern that would allow the safest landing. The ocean, however, rarely cooperated. Swells could lift the wingtips dangerously or crash against the hull with bone-jarring force. Harding remembered one landing in particular near a drifting life raft occupied by 3 aviators who had been floating for nearly 2 days. The sea was rough, the wind unpredictable, and every instinct warned him that attempting a landing was reckless. But he saw the men waving weakly, one slumped motionlessly against the raft's edge, and he knew the decision was already made. The Catalina touched the water hard, skidding across the surface before stabilizing, and the crew rushed to haul the survivors aboard. Harding could still recall the look in their eyes, hollow, sunburned, disbelieving at first, then suddenly overflowing with relief so profound it seemed to shake the cabin itself. Inside the Catalina, the fuselage transformed into an improvised infirmary. Stretchers were secured along the floor, medical kits were opened, and water canteens were passed from hand to trembling hand. The crew worked with quiet urgency, wrapping wounds, treating dehydration, whispering reassurances to men who had already begun preparing for death. Harding had seen men cry openly during those flights, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming realization that they had been found in an ocean that rarely forgave mistakes. Some were barely conscious, mumbling words lost to delirium. Others simply lay still, staring upward in silent gratitude as the Catalina lifted them toward safety. But rescue missions carried their own dangers. Taking off from open water tested both the aircraft and the pilot, especially when heavy with soaked survivors. Harding knew the feeling of the Catalina straining against the sea, her hull dragging through water that clung stubbornly to every inch of metal. The engines roared, pushing the aircraft forward as waves slapped against the bow. The moment when the hull finally lifted free, just barely clearing the swell, was always accompanied by a sharp intake of breath from every man aboard. It was in those seconds that Harding felt closest to the edge between triumph and tragedy. And now, as the Catalina pushed through the sky carrying the news of the Japanese fleet, Harding knew that rescue missions would soon become even more crucial. For where great battles formed, the ocean demanded its due, scattering men across its surface like fragile debris. The Catalina had found fleets, had shadowed convoys, had struck in the night, but its greatest test was still ahead, waiting beneath the storm that the enemy armada was bringing with it.
As Harding guided the Catalina homeward through the fading light of late afternoon, he felt the weight of the day settle across the wings like a silent passenger. The ocean below lay still, stretched into shimmering plates of gold and slate blue as the sun drifted lower, and the aircraft hummed steadily as though unaware of the monumental message it carried. The Japanese fleet they had discovered that morning was now steaming east at full speed, and the quiet inside the Catalina was filled not with relief, but with the heavy knowledge that every minute of flight brought the Pacific closer to a confrontation that would spread across the horizon like fire. Harding looked through the windscreen and felt time slow, as if the world waited for what history would soon record. Yet even in this tense calm, he could not help but think of the role his aircraft had played, how a slow, unassuming flying boat had helped shape the fate of the world. In the years since the war had begun, Harding had witnessed firsthand how the Catalina changed the rhythm of naval warfare. It had been the eyes of the fleet when the ocean was too vast, too deceptive, too empty for surface ships to comprehend. It had seen enemy carriers long before fighter squadrons engaged them. It had traced the routes of supply ships and shadowed submarines at periscope depth. It had mapped the Pacific battle by battle, sometimes invisible, sometimes hunted, sometimes barely returning home on its last drops of fuel. Harding understood now that the Catalina's impact had not come from speed or strength, but from its ability to be everywhere the enemy wished it was not. Its endurance had become a quiet form of power, one built not upon intimidation, but upon persistence. He thought of the countless missions flown by crews like his, long nights without rest, rescue landings in seas that swallowed men whole, patrols that stretched the limits of human concentration. He remembered stories whispered among pilots, the Catalina that stalked a convoy for 17 hours without being detected, guiding Allied bombers with steady radio calls, the Black Cat that slipped into a harbor under moonless skies and ignited fuel depots with pinpoint drops, the rescue crews who landed in typhoons to retrieve pilots who had clung to life with their fingernails embedded in half-inflated rafts. Each mission told a story not of heroic spectacle, but of quiet, relentless effort that often determined whether a battle was won before the first shot was ever fired. And even as the war pressed towards its most ferocious chapters, Harding knew that the Catalina's legacy would stretch beyond the Pacific. Already rumors spread among crews about the aircraft's future after the fighting ended. Some believed Catalinas would serve as water bombers, taming wildfires in the American West. Others imagined them patrolling distant coasts, searching for lost vessels or ferrying supplies to villages where no runway existed. A few men dreamed of converting them into private flying yachts, drifting leisurely from island to island in peacetime skies. Harding suspected that these visions held truth. The Catalina, built with patience and endurance woven into its frame, seemed destined for lives quieter but no less essential than the one it lived now. Yet for all its future promise, its legacy in war could never be understated. It had changed operations by revealing what had once been hidden. It had saved thousands whose stories might otherwise have ended silently in the open sea. It had struck the enemy under the cover of darkness when no other aircraft could reach so far. Harding felt a deep, steady respect rise within him, something close to reverence, though he would never say such a thing aloud. The Catalina was proof that not all heroes traveled fast or shone brightly. Some moved slowly through fog and darkness, carrying the weight of hope in their wide, patient wings. As Midway's thin strip of shoreline emerged on the horizon, Harding adjusted the Catalina's pitch, listening to the engine's rumble in a tone that felt almost familiar, almost human. Below him the ocean stretched in a vast silence, but Harding felt the tension surging again, the knowledge that soon this very water would roar with the chaos of battle, that the enemy fleet was no longer an abstract threat, but a real force bearing down upon them. He knew that when the sun rose again, the Catalina would be called into service once more, not just as a scout, but as a rescuer, a witness, and perhaps even a shield. And as the landing gear remained tucked away and the flying boat descended toward the soft gleam of the lagoon, Harding realized that history would never remember the Catalina for how it looked, nor for the weapons it carried, but for the simple truth that entire battles had turned because a slow, unremarkable aircraft had been in the right place at the right moment and had refused to give up the sky.